Hi there. My name is Greg DePoe. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto working with Dr. Michael Inslet. I'm really excited to be here at APA 2021 and to be presenting with these great researchers in this symposium titled What is Empathy? New Insights in Theory and Measurement. The title of my talk today is The Experience of Empathy in Everyday Life. Thanks so much for coming, as I said, and I really look forward to any questions you might have, so don't hesitate to reach out. So, empathy is a critical construct for individual psychological functioning, healthy relationships, and group living. Despite this importance, we lack a descriptive account of how empathy is experienced in everyday life. And researchers in the field have called for increased ecological validity in our investigations and to examine the construct across a range of social and emotional contexts. One way to do this is to look at empathy in everyday life using experience sampling. Now, as Fred and Judy have so eloquently pointed out and alluded to earlier, empathy is a difficult concept to define for researchers. Not only that, it varies among lay people as well. So in the current study, we defined empathy for our participants as an umbrella construct involving three separate but related constructs: perspective taking, the ability to understand the point of view of another person; emotion sharing, the ability to feel a similar emotion to one that you observed; and compassion, the ability or tendency to care about the emotional well-being of another person. We define these in turn for our participants as well. So to accomplish our goals, we took three sort of steps. The first step was collecting our sample. To do this, we used quota sampling to ensure that our sample matched US Census data on a number of key demographic parameters that empathy is known to vary along. So these included sex, education, ethnicity, region, income, and age. After we collected our sample of 246 US adults that was representative on these parameters, we gave them a baseline survey that included measures like the Big Five, as well as, importantly for our purposes, trait empathy measures like the Interpersonal Reactivity Index and the Empathy Selection Task, among others. We also defined empathy for them at this point. And at the end of the survey, we gave them instructions to download the MetricWire app, which we would use to prompt them in their daily lives and ask them about their recent experiences. So this is a method known as experience sampling that's proven quite promising. So we prompted people 7 times a day for 1 week, and we asked them about their current subjective well-being, as well as their recent experiences in terms of whether someone has had an opportunity to, whether they've had an opportunity to empathize with anyone, whether anyone has had an opportunity to empathize with them, and whether they've engaged in a pro-social behavior for someone else in the last 15 minutes. When people did report an opportunity to empathize, we dug for a little more details to get this description. We asked them how close the other person was, what emotion they observed, how positive or negative it was, whether they felt personal distress, and whether they actually experienced empathy at the time. We asked them how voluntary empathizing or not was. And then when empathy occurred, we asked them, what form did it take? Did you share the other person's emotions? Did you take their perspective? And did you feel compassion for them? We then, for any component that occurred, we asked about extent, difficulty, and confidence, and took the average of those component ratings to get the average extent, difficulty, and confidence of empathy itself. When someone reported that they had an opportunity to receive empathy themselves, we asked them whether the other person shared their emotions, whether they took their perspective, and whether they felt compassion for them, to what extent they did so. So after this process, we had a data set of 246 US adults that was representative of the US population, at least on those parameters I described. They answered a total of 7,343 surveys, and this data is nested within participant and survey day. So to deal with this nested nature of the data, we did multi-level models, including a random intercept for both participant and day, and this allowed us to explore the data. So my co-author, the brilliant Zoe Francis, has some really cool analysis on empathy and prosocial behavior across the time of day and how that interacts with people's chronotype. So I encourage you to check that out in the Journal of Research and Personality. We've also got a paper out now called The Experience of Empathy in Everyday Life, which describes the findings that I'll talk about today in more depth. So I encourage you to check that out as well. So in everyday life, people reported empathy opportunities fairly commonly. There was about almost 1,400 in our over 7,000 surveys, so about 19% of surveys. It's a fairly common experience, but there's a lot of variability around that. Some people see more opportunities than others. One thing that was interesting here is that while we tend to focus on negative emotions in the empathy literature, people in fact empathize with positive emotions or notice opportunities to empathize with positive emotions 3 times as often as negative. So that's really interesting. When people do flag an opportunity to empathize in daily life, they experience empathy at very high rates. So about 88% of the time that an opportunity was reported, they reported actually experiencing empathy itself. Another thing that jumps out on this diagram here, this is called a Sankey flow network diagram, by the way. Another thing that jumps out here is that prosocial behavior was highly correlated with empathy opportunities. So when an opportunity was reported in the last 15 minutes, prosocial behavior was more likely to be reported as well. Interestingly, again, while we focus on strangers in many of our empathy vignettes and stimuli that we use to elicit empathy in the lab, in daily life, people are most often empathizing with close others, and this is perhaps unsurprising. People also empathize to a greater extent as closeness increases. So one first takeaway from this is that while the modal of experience of empathy in the literature is for the pain of strangers, in daily life, individuals in fact empathize with positive emotions and with close others more often. Now, I mentioned these different components: emotion sharing, perspective taking, and compassion. They've been differentiated in the lab and in the literature, but other researchers have pointed out that in social interactions, they likely interact. We looked at how often they co-occurred or didn't co-occur. So did perspective taking occur in isolation? Was it just emotion sharing, just compassion? Did just 2 occur? Did all 3 occur? And what we find here from what I could call a Francis Venn diagram here is that most of the time, all 3 are co-occurring. So emotion sharing, compassion, perspective taking all seem to co-occur together most of the time in these complex, ecologically valid social interactions. And not only that, but as you feel compassion to a greater extent, you also tend to share emotions to a greater extent and take perspective to a greater extent. So a second takeaway here is that while technically dissociable, constructs like emotion sharing, perspective taking, and compassion often co-occur in complex, real-life social interactions. I was also really interested to explore whether empathy was associated with prosocial behavior in daily life. As we saw earlier on the Sankey flow network diagram, empathy is associated with increased prosocial behavior, but I was curious how these broke down with valence. So what I found was that empathy wasn't purely a response to suffering. In fact, people also commonly reported prosocial acts in the same window that they had a positive empathy opportunity or a mixed valence empathy opportunity. So this suggests that prosocial behavior is associated with empathy in daily life and not just as a response to suffering. On top of these empathy opportunities, whether someone empathized or not and the extent to which they empathized were themselves predictive of prosocial behavior. Now, while this is the case with state empathy, quite clearly, this relationship was not captured with trait empathy measures. There was no significant relationship between global or retrospective reports of empathy and prosocial behavior in daily life. Another really interesting question that I was curious about was, well, empathy in daily life may be associated with helping others, but is it good for the empathizer themselves? So how does empathy impact subjective well-being? What I found was that trait empathy was mostly unrelated to subjective well-being, with only a couple of measures, the personal distress subscale of the IRI and the empathy subscale of the empathy index, being negatively associated with subjective well-being. But this isn't what we see in state empathy, with most measures being positively associated with subjective well-being, and opportunities themselves being overall associated with increased subjective well-being. One reason for this discrepancy could be the fact that items focus on the negative responses to negative emotions, whereas people in daily life are more commonly responding to positive emotions. Here we see that people feel higher subjective well-being than their average well-being when they have a positive empathy opportunity. So each dot here is an individual survey where someone's reported their current subjective well-being, and the lines are means and the notches are 95% confidence intervals. So we can see that a negative empathy opportunity has the average subjective well-being about equal to that of having no empathy opportunity at all. On the other hand, empathy opportunities for mixed and positive emotions are associated with increased subjective well-being. So if you have an opportunity, you may well have increased subjective well-being. However, if you're having an opportunity for negative emotions, then this may not be different from just having no opportunity at all. So the fact that empathy is associated with prosocial behavior and subjective well-being, but only when measured at the state level. So what explains this discrepancy? One reason could be that experience sampling is able to capture associations that global measures miss. That's possible. But I think another theoretical reason for this could be that existing trait measures are not adequately capturing the existing heterogeneity of actual empathy experiences. And I think that this possibility is being underscored by some of the talks by some of my collaborators in this symposium. For example, we've seen in Brett's talk that responses may differ by valence. So how people emotion share, that may pull apart by whether they're sharing negative or positive emotions. And furthermore, people may differ in their response depending on the type of suffering. So if they're dealing with physical or emotional suffering, their own response may differ. They may empathize in a different way. So for more on that, definitely check out Brett Murphy and Jenny Steller's talks in this symposium as well. So for takeaway number 3, what I found is that in daily life, empathy is generally associated with positive outcomes. However, not all aspects of empathy are positive or beneficial, and the valence of the target emotion is really a critical moderator to consider. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my talk, and I just want to say thank you very much to Judy and Fred and Brett and Jenny for allowing me to be part of the symposium with them. Thank you as well to Dr. Zoe Francis and Dr. Michael Inslet for writing this paper with me and helping me collect this data. And I also want to thank my funders. And last but not least, I really want to thank you, the APA attendees, for coming. And like I said, I'm really looking forward to your feedback and any questions you may have. So I've got my email at the bottom there. You can also contact me on Twitter if you like. And here is when I'll be holding some Q&A. So I'll have one on August 12th and August 14th from 4 to 5 and 12 to 1. So definitely come check those out if you want to come chat with me. Thanks again, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your APA 2021. Bye.